Look, I might get us started for tonight. I know we probably will have a few more people joining us, but I'll just do a few introductions to start this. This really it does say spiritual abuse 3. It's our third conversation around this, but this particular topic associated with spiritual abuse is forgiveness, and we do feel that this is a conversation that will go on throughout our work, at least over the next year or so. And we certainly have a second episode on forgiveness that we'll talk about at the end of this conversation tonight. So, welcome everyone. My name's Jenny Clark. I'm the Deputy Chair of a special group that we have within Queensland Churches Together that deals with domestic and family violence and the relationship between churches and church communities and that issue, which we all feel we can make a significant contribution. We can develop our understanding as members of church communities more deeply, and we can also develop good practice around this issue that is tailored towards church communities. We also feel that spiritual abuse is really our territory, that there are lots and lots of good resources and good services operating around domestic violence, both generally and around either specifically targeted on a cohort of people or a particular area of domestic violence. I'm just sorry, I've got this funny symbol that's come up against my name. Jackie, if you could have a little check of that for me would be good. I hope it doesn't mean...
It just means that you're spotlighted for everybody.
Oh dear. Okay, thank you, Jackie. So I'll start us off firstly with an acknowledgement of country, and this is the acknowledgement of country that we use at Queensland Churches Together. So it's Queensland Churches Together acknowledges traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and particularly traditional owners of the lands on which we're all participating in this session tonight, where we're sitting. And recognises the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present and emerging. So tonight we have two wonderful women who will share with you their own personal experience of both domestic violence and particularly that layer of spiritual abuse that they've directly experienced. We're going to, as I said, do this as the start of a conversation, and also recognising that almost no one in Australia has not been impacted in some way by domestic and family violence. It's just such a pervasive issue in our community. I think in recent years there's been a lot of progress to raise awareness. Not too sure we've had the same process and same level of success in looking at new ways of engaging, relating, addressing abusive behaviour and hopefully reducing and eradicating it. So I'll hand over to the chair of our group, Carol Danby, and Carol will open us in prayer.
Thank you, Jenny. And good evening, everyone, and welcome again. This evening, or preparing for this evening, we've had a number of meetings and struggled with the scripture that talks about forgiveness and Peter asking Jesus, how many times must I forgive? And 7 times 7, and Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. So almost, an attitude of forgiveness all the time, and how difficult that must be, especially for people who have been impacted by abuse. So I chose the story from scripture of Mark chapter 4, and it's the calming of the storm. And I wonder if we might think about the people who maybe feel like they're in a boat and it's about to sink, that they're being swamped, that God's asleep and they're in danger, that they're going down for the third time, that they feel utterly vulnerable as we listen to the story and then Jesus's response. Jesus had been with the crowds all day, healing their sick and teaching them about God. And later that day, he said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." And so, leaving the crowds behind, they took him with them in the boat. Other boats went with them. When suddenly a great windstorm arose and the waves began to beat into the boat until the boat was about to sink. But Jesus was asleep in the stern on a cushion. The disciples went to him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we're about to perish?" Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Where is your faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Thank you, Carol.
I have a poem just to finish that might
good.
help
Sorry.
lead us in. It's called The Wait and the Whisper. I waited for words that never came, and "I'm sorry" hung in silent air, the wounds still fresh, the ache still loud, while he moved on unaware. I held the grudge like armor worn, thinking pain gave power back, but it only grew more heavy still and kept me tethered to the lack. Closure seemed like a locked old door, and I without the key. Just echoes of what should have been, and all he didn't see. But healing whispered something soft. Forgive, not to excuse, but to free your heart from chains of hurt and choose what you won't lose. So I laid the weight beside the road and let the ache unbind. Not for him, but for the peace that I deserve to find. Gracious God, we ask you to be with us as we discuss and struggle with your command to forgive. And let us explore this with our wonderful people. Over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you for that. Very, very helpful in getting us into the space that we want to occupy tonight. We all know that forgiveness can be the hardest thing to do as Christians, that we can easily forgive people that we've got high levels of trust in, who we feel are genuine in their remorse, but forgiving people that have done very bad things and over long periods of time is quite something else, and is something that we need to continue to learn how to develop this concept of a practice of forgiveness. And how can we do that in a way that that is helpful to moving our faith and also moving forward ourselves from significant abuse and control and other things that have happened to people in these situations. So tonight We have Charmaine and Felicity, both women who have direct experience of domestic abuse and are very brave to be able to tell those stories in ways that can be meaningful and can facilitate a meaningful discussion around this issue. So I'm going to hand over to these wonderful women who are also part of our group in Queensland Churches Together. They'll talk for a little while. I'll start some questions off and then hand over for other people to also ask questions and participate in the discussions. So over to you both. Felicity, I think.
Charmaine, thank you very much, Jenny.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for everybody who has joined online here tonight. Yes, it certainly is a very interesting subject, and yes, we just want to share with you a little bit of our journey. And Felicity, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed by me this evening. And yes, I am a survivor and hopefully now a thriver of domestic and family violence myself as well too. And there are many, many different ways of looking at forgiveness. Some of the 3 steps, the 4 steps, the 10 steps or whatever. But the main thing is that forgiveness is very important. But I'd like to discuss your story tonight, Felicity, along the lines of a book that was very, very helpful to me in my journey. The book is called Forgiving What You Can't Forget. Forgiving What You Can't Forget, because that is where it is. It's by Lisa TerKeurst, and she outlines various different things, and we will also look at the verse of Jesus as well, when he said in Luke 23:34, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And so along these steps, could we proceed along these lines, do you think, Felicity?
Charmaine, thank you, and JCDVPP for inviting me this evening. Absolutely, I'd be delighted to proceed along those lines.
Thanks very much for sharing. So the first step is name the pain. This may seem quite obvious, but we have to name it. What was it? Who was it? How was it? How did it happen? So Felicity, can you just share a little bit of this step 1, name the pain for you?
Sure. My pain was born out of the experience of being seemingly trapped in a highly emotionally and financially abusive traditional marriage for 20 years to my malignant narcissist ex-husband. How did this happen, you ask? Well, with the benefit of hindsight, which is is always an asset, but it is in hindsight. I will attempt to explain this as briefly as I can. In my early 20s, I was a victim ready to happen. I was very shy, lacking in confidence, had low self-esteem, was highly empathetic in nature. I was not particularly street smart or experienced with intimate relationships. I'd been raised in a very conservative Christian family that believed in the sanctity of marriage and family. When my older, worldly, good-looking and charming, narcissistic ex-husband came into my life, I guess I was simply swept off my feet, and we were married 3 years later. When we first met and after we were married, we both had good and well-paying jobs. All our combined income was put towards a deposit for our first home, and once purchased, into much-needed renovations and the mortgage, of course. My then husband was working full-time shift work as an aircraft supervisor, and so I naturally had to organise everything I did around his schedule so that he could rest and then look after the kids whilst I was at work part-time once they had arrived, obviously. We began investing in property and shares for our children's private schooling and our eventual retirement. Unfortunately, when our youngest child was 18 months old, I was thrust back into the workforce full-time, simply to put food on the table and keep a roof over our heads, after the airline my husband worked for absolutely collapsed. I look back on this and realise that this apparent loss of status, independence, obviously income, and professional status and growth brought about his growing tide of shame and jealousy and ultimately resentment, which was then directed at me. As my husband was unable to find a new job that could exceed my full-time nursing income, he became a home hubby and I became the principal income earner for our young family. As part of his newly found home-based responsibilities, I handed over all the household finances for him to manage. Around this time, though, personal computers were just becoming part of our lives. He took great interest in this new technology and left me far behind. I was far too busy trying to manage full-time work and a young family. He was an early adopter of internet banking, which completely bamboozled me, and it was password protected, locking me out completely. He also stopped our paper-based monthly bank statements, claiming to be environmentally friendly, so I had no chance of keeping any tabs on what was going on. Unfortunately for me, his ever-growing resentment towards me for having a corporate position quickly led to abuse. However, my ex-husband did not physically or sexually abuse me. He didn't need to in order to gain full power and control in our relationship. Instead, he preyed on my low self-esteem, slowly but surely creating a culture of codependence, and then constantly reinforced this with various forms of coercive control through the use of manipulative behaviours commonly referred to as gaslighting. He even involved the children so that when I questioned the validity of what I was being told, they would back him up and tell me I was either wrong or forgetful or cruel or completely lying to their father. I was like a puppet on a string. As a result of years of this emotional, financial, and later spiritual abuse, I was exhausted and really lost all sense of myself and any hope for a different or better future. I guess I would describe myself in my 30s and early 40s as the lights were on, but no one was home. He either had an excuse or an answer for everything, and I was led to believe that I was actually the one causing all the relationship and financial problems that we had. According to him and our children, I was apparently too sensitive, too proud, not earning enough, spending way too much on our children's education in a private school and their extracurricular activities, spending too much on food and utilities, never happy, nagging him constantly, too fat, too lazy, looking old and tired, ugly and stupid, just to name a few of my faults. Whenever I did react or question where all our money was going and try to make him acknowledge that what he was doing was wrong and putting our marriage and our children's welfare and our financial future at significant risk, he would just get really angry and retaliate with questioning my fundamental Christian values and beliefs. How could I possibly call myself a Christian woman and a loyal wife if I didn't trust my husband completely, forgive him when he made mistakes, submit to his will, and acknowledge his position as head of our household? Unfortunately, this spiritual abuse was perpetuated and reinforced by my attendance at church. Please don't take this the wrong way, but when we recite the Lord's Prayer in particular, the line, "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us," I took to heart and thought it meant I had to continually forgive my ex-husband's transgressions, even if he never even acknowledged what he was doing to us was wrong on so many levels, let alone try to make amends for his abusive behaviours. Sermons on the importance of forgiveness and the sanctity of marriage and family just reinforced my acceptance of this constant domestic abuse. My godly guilt reinforced his outbursts and kept me silent about what was going on behind closed doors. In my view and his, I was floundering at being a good Christian wife and mother. Consequently, I took on more and more hours of work on top of my full-time job, including a second part-time job, ironing, and other roles in order to service our ever-growing debts and maintain what looked to be, from the outside, a comfortable life. I was working between 80 to 100 hours a week, and still we made little to no headway financially. In fact, we were getting further and further behind in repayments and having to take out more loans and make refinancing arrangements to keep a roof over our heads, food on the table, and the children in school. I was receiving threatening calls from debt collectors at least daily, whereas he was working part-time, was never to blame for anything, and he had complete control over our finances. According to him, it was all under control. And in fact, we were doing better than most because he was carefully investing for our future. I just needed to trust him. Given the cost of living crisis the world was experiencing back then, just as it is again now, I believed him. I guess I wanted to believe him. I also loved him and didn't want to believe that the man I so loved and was father to our children could possibly be robbing us all blind. He also kept stating that I was just overreacting, not being sensible, logical, and professional, but rather a weak and hysterical woman. It was an absolute nightmare. What exactly he did with all that money I was earning, plus borrowing money from friends and going cap in hand to my father to ask for help with our children's private school fees without my knowledge or consent, remains somewhat of a mystery to this day. However, I eventually found out through months of amateur forensic accounting with the patient help of a very dear friend who had also recently come out of a long-term abusive traditional marriage herself. We actually found out that my ex-husband had certainly enjoyed womanizing at my expense and sustained heavy losses on the stock market from trading in the futures markets and having to pay margin calls when the stock market suddenly turned against him. Consequently, he'd managed to lose everything we had, a home and 2 rental properties, a substantial share portfolio, and other smaller investments. By the time he left, there were huge 6-figure debts to pay, and due to the outdated laws around marriage, I was left solely responsible for all of them.
Oh dear, Felicity, thank you so much for sharing part of your story with us. And there's a lot to unpack there, much of which happened and much is beyond the scope of this evening's session. We could go on about it. However, let's continue to look at the next step. Grieve the pain. You were obviously going through a lot of pain at that time. You see, grieving is dreaming in reverse. When we dream, something's still ahead of us. But when we grieve, something is taken away from us. So how did you do that, Felicity?
That's a really interesting question, Charmin. I have to admit that initially not well, especially as I was left with all my ex-husband's debts that he had accumulated under both our names. And he just walked away from when I finally asked him to leave. In fact, it took me approximately 2 years after we had separated to reach a point where thoughts of my ex-husband and his much longer-term girlfriend did not consume my every waking moment, and indeed most of my dreams as well. I was struggling with every aspect of my life. Thankfully, I had managed to keep my well-paying corporate position, and quite frankly, I can't tell you how. So miraculously, and after 2 years, I was finally able to pay all my household expenses on time and in full every month, and even start to have a tiny amount of money left over with which to start a savings plan. So
that's amazing. And that does lead us nicely into the next step. You were starting by this stage to process the pain, do what you could, and do some things. So how did you eventually keep processing the pain of what you were going through?
Gee, if I'm really honest, at times I'm still processing that pain. Thankfully, with God's grace and wise counsel from various angels, as I describe them, my resentment towards my ex-husband and his now wife has lessened over time. Professional counselling, social distancing, setting of very strict information sharing boundaries with the children, and almost zero contact with my ex-husband and his wife over the last 11 years has really helped. Although it didn't feel like it at the time, it turned out to be a blessing that our children were 13 and 17 years old when this all, when we actually separated, which meant there was very little I had to consult or ask my ex-husband consent for with regards to their ongoing care. And as he refused to provide any ongoing financial support for them, except for the minimal amount of child support that he was forced to pay, months after I put the initial application in, I was not legally obliged to provide him with any information on the children's care. And so the significant gradual improvement in my financial position has also lessened my pain and resentment towards them.
That's so, based on what you've shared so far, the step 4, remembering God's forgiveness, from Luke 23:34, where Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." What was that like in your experience? I know it was hard for me.
Well, yeah, it hasn't been easy. And there have been many times where I've pushed back on God so hard with regards to this. As a practicing Christian, I acknowledge that I have a responsibility to forgive my ex-husband and his wife for their intense period of abuse and lingering abuse that exists to this day. According to the few mutual contacts that we still have, they continue to maintain the facade that they were the injured parties and I was the villain in this story, and I continue to malign them. I've spent years trying to prove my innocence and learnt the hard way that the unwritten statute of limitations for grief, especially for divorce, rather than the death of a loved one, is approximately 12 months. After this time, very few people ask if you're okay, or are you still, or even still willing to listen to you talk about your painful situation. So I stopped.
Yes, and certainly forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We can never forget what happened, and but it doesn't excuse the harm that has been done to us or to anybody. But it also doesn't necessarily mean making up with the person who caused you harm. I think, and I've come to believe over many years, that forgiveness allows us to focus on ourselves and help us go on with life. So according to Lisa TeKirsch, she says that as well too, releasing the pain. How did you go about doing that, Felicity?
That's another great question, Charmin. I guess I've learnt the hard way that God's forgiveness was and is still much more about me than about the other parties involved. In order to start the healing process and allow for the possibility of new love in my life, I had to learn to lean on God for the strength and resolve to release the pain by forgiving them, and most importantly, myself. To do this, I have and continue to draw on the wise counsel of a couple of trusted friends and verses from the Bible. My favourite is Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30. "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I can't begin to tell you how many thousands of times I have read that verse over the past 11 years. But it's one I just keep coming back to.
And continue to take that. Yes, thank you. And that certainly is part of the next step, which is keep forgiving. And that's based on the passage that Carol alluded to earlier this evening, Matthew 18:21, where Peter came to Jesus to ask him, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times?" I would have loved to have been there at that time and just watching Peter go up to Jesus and think, "Oh, I'm pretty good. Yes, 7 times to forgive." But Jesus' response was, "No, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And you see also, the sign of progress isn't the ability never to get hurt or offended or knocked off balance emotionally again, but rather to let the pain that has happened and the pain of this to work for us instead of against us. What's been your experience, Felicity?
Look, I have to confess that this verse is really confronting. However, it is, as you've identified, at the very core of our Christian faith. And it is something that, with the help of God's grace, I have to do very regularly, even with the little or no contact that I have had with and to this day have with my ex-husband and his wife.
And again, the forgiveness, a big part of that is forgiving ourselves as well too. And then the last step, which is again one of the hard ones, pray for the one who wronged you. You see, giving and receiving forgiveness makes up nearly half of the Lord's Prayer, and it reminds us what the human heart needs every day. We need God. We need to be forgiven, and in turn, we need to forgive others. So, Felicity, how do you manage this practically now?
Look, as my ex-husband and I have two children together, even though they're now adults, we are literally eagerly awaiting the arrival of our first grandchild. Our eldest daughter is in labour right now, and quite advanced. And the safe arrival of this child will bring many reasons to celebrate, of course, but will also bring renewed need for me to keep forgiving and keep praying for my ex-husband and his wife, so that this precious little bundle doesn't grow up experience generational trauma. This has been very much on my mind, and particularly as I prepared for this evening. And it's also very much in my prayers, because it's 11 years since I separated from my ex-husband, 9 years since we divorced. And yes, my life is so different and so much better than it was back then. And I am truly grateful for that. But I'm still on a lifelong journey of forgiveness, and I know there will be testing times, even amongst this wondrous celebratory time. So I am relying on God's grace to very much to bolster me and keep me going, and keep me circumspect and on track.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much again for sharing. And Felicity, I agree with you that while we're still here on this earth, we're all on the journey. But forgiveness is one of the most healing decisions that we can embrace. And indeed, we believe our ability to forgive others is indeed the testament to the transformative power of Christ's love in our lives, as you've so beautifully expressed just now. And the final encouragement is to continue to engage in prayer, to continue to seek God's strengths. And we must remember that Jesus' example, when we are struggling to forgive, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they did. Thank you very much, Felicity.
Thank you, Sharman.
Back to you, Jenny.
Oh, thank you, Sharman. Gosh, there's so much in that wonderful presentation. To draw that structured approach that you've provided, Sharman, and Felicity, thank you so much for being prepared to be put on the spot with some of those questions and some of those challenges about how they fitted into your own experience. Thank you so much. A couple of things that occurred to me was it is a big concept for forgiveness, and someone, when we met in a little planning session for this this session tonight, said, there's a bit of here where some of the limitations we have in English, and when we look at the scriptures, we're looking at translations of translations. Forgiveness comes down as one word. And so, when you bump into someone in front of you on the bus, when it breaks suddenly, you say, oh, I'm sorry. And the other person says, no, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Is that forgiveness? Well, it is, but it's certainly not the same as the depth and breadth and complexity of forgiveness when there's been a hurt over a long period of time, and that's been deep and fundamental. And the person perpetrating that seems to have no acknowledgement that they have perpetrated a wrong, as opposed to the person that bumps into someone when the bus breaks suddenly. So very big difference. Jesus often talks about forgiveness as forgiving a debt. There's lots of, parables about servants and debts being forgiven, and that being a demonstration of forgiveness. And I know that can be a kind of helpful concept about a debt that is just lifted, in terms of the impact it could have. Felicity, one of the things I keep coming to when I hear you speak is a reminder to us all that victims of domestic and family violence can come from anywhere. They can be young, they can be old, they can be in straight relationships, same-sex relationships. There is no immunisation, there's no protective factor for relationships to become abusive. And that's why I think it's so important that we build up a knowledge, particularly within our church, of what red flags to abuse are, which Felicity, you had many of those. I guess the question I was going to ask on that theme was, did you find that people looked at you and said, oh, here's this nice family, they live in a nice area, the police have never been called to that home, and somehow doubted the validity of your experience because they had a mindset that domestic and family violence happens in some other place, out there, over there, amongst people who rely on the police as their first response to incidents?
Absolutely, Jenny. Look, you couldn't have said it any better. Just as our little logo in the corner says "Not in my church," I guess I could have almost said "Not in our suburb." And
yes.
I don't mean that to sound too highfalutin by any means. I've never lived in what you'd call a really high socioeconomic area, but I've certainly been what I guess you'd classify as middle class all my life. Again, there's those stereotypes, and they, when we talk about domestic and family violence, and I was absolutely of the same opinion as the vast majority of people, like, oh, well, I didn't identify what I was going through as domestic and family violence because my husband had never physically hit me or sexually abused me. And of course, I don't want to take away from the serious nature of either of those aspects to domestic and family violence, because absolutely, if that's going on, that is 100% a 000 emergency. But, for mine, it was more, oh, here's a difficult personality. Oh, if I just work a bit harder, if I just try and placate it, if I make everything perfect at home, if I work harder, if I bring more money in, blah, 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 it will be okay. And of course it wasn't. And he kept changing the goalposts. So if I achieved something like bringing in extra income, if I, paid off one credit card, well, then another one would magically appear and he would have, maxed that out within a very short period of time. It was more about he kept changing the goalposts. So it was much more of a coercive. I know coercive control really is the overarching umbrella, and under that all these other, the particular types of abuse. And I'm so grateful that, I only suffered the 3 of those, but that was crippling for a long time. Certainly the last 10 years of our marriage. And look, I don't share this a lot with people, but because of the audience that we have, I'm prepared to. But I had made a very detailed plan about my own suicide because I'd got to the point where the only bill I was paying on time was my life insurance. With the view that if I took my own life, then I could still carry on providing for my family. So if I could not work to the level that I needed to produce the income to service all these debts that he was creating, upon my death, that should wipe it all out, and there should be sufficient left over to buy a house, provide ongoing care for my kids' education. I'd also, transferred my superannuation. I'm trying to think of the right term, but ongoing power of attorney and things like that to my brother. So that in the event of my death, a lot of people don't realise that superannuation, if you're not careful, it will just go straight to your spouse. And so you really need to nominate the beneficiaries. And so I was, doing all of that, thinking that, because I was so desperate by that stage, I was thinking the only out I have is to take my own life, make it look accidental, and then they can cash in on my, or my brother can, access my superannuation and make the changes that put in the safeguards that I felt my children needed. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. And, but to the outside, I was like a duck in the water. I was paddling like crazy to stay above the surface of the water. But on the surface, it's like, yep, get up, get dressed, look good, all that stuff, look professional, go off to work, do my full day's work, plus come home, do extra things. I used to do ironing for a whole stack of friends and get cash in hand. It just went on and on. I was a homestay mum. I worked all week, all weekend. I had an online business. I had a party plan business. You name it. I just, if it had the opportunity of making a bit of extra money on the side, I was in it.
Oh, thank you. And a question for you, Charmaine. You talk about grieving the pain. How important or not important is venting that and having a safe space to
yes,
is of course a bit different.
But I think those first two, when you actually name what is it, yes, he did that to me, or that happened, or this incident happened, to really specifically name that pain, and then yes, you grieve. And I used to get so angry, and I say God is the only person you can talk to at 3 o'clock in the morning, because nobody else is around. But also along that story of people not believing it happens around us, my case was, yes, there was some physical violence involved, and silly me at the time, I thought, oh well, I'll just cover it up and placate my husband and just go along, and the stories that I could make up. But this one particular day, we were going into our church, and I had a fat lip that day, and I thought, no, I'm going to church, and just do that. And as we were walking in, the welcomer on the door looked at us both and said to my husband at the time, if I didn't know you better, I would have said that you had hit Charmaine. And we just walked in. And I lived with it, and I made up some figure, or something happened, or I lifted or put the blame onto me. But the beautiful part about that is that just this year, actually, which was 19 years since that particular thing happened, I was able to talk to the person. I said, you may not remember this, but when we were staying, when I was in that situation, he knew that I'd come out of a domestic violence situation. I said, you said that when I walked through the church doors that day about that. And I said, that was a lie. And I was living the lie. And it took me another year or two to realize that when I was covering up for those things and for the bump on my lip or the bruise or whatever it was, I was living a lie. And it wasn't until I came to the realization, and I think it was in the middle of an alpha course, that I went, I can't do this. This isn't right. This is a lie that I am living. And so I was able to very slowly go through. But yes, other people thought, oh, this is fine. It doesn't happen in my suburb. It doesn't happen in my environment. So yes, grieving, yes. And, yeah, I thought, this doesn't happen to me. My parents were happily married for 65 years. Why is it happening to me? Yeah, the grief, and again, but it's only God's blessing, and God, through it all, that miraculously and providentially, and he just lovingly is there to love us and continue to keep loving and keep supporting us when we need him.
Thank you. I think that's a great point to put this out there for any other audience questions. Jackie, who knows how all these things work, I'm sure can make sure we get questions in a sort of orderly way. If you have a question, just come on and ask that of our two speakers or of the group generally.
I was wondering, which is harder, do you think? Is it harder to forgive yourself or to forgive the person who was abusing? And are there other people that you need to forgive? I mean, did you find that you had to forgive other family members or church?
Good question.
Sharman, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jackie. And I would say it is hard on both sides. I remember there was one incident with my situation before. I had to forgive my in-law, my husband's father, because something had happened financially that wasn't correct. And it was years for me to, forgive that. And I remember I had to stay in their place one night, and I said, I have to forgive. I can't sleep here tonight if I don't forgive them. I mean, he didn't know. He didn't realize what had happened or the angst that it had caused me. But it was the grief that I had to do, and I had to forgive myself for holding and harboring that grief for so long. But when I did, it was much easier for me. So, yes, but it's still hard. Yes, but you have to continue to be kind to yourself and realize that at the time you did the best thing that you did. You stayed in the situation. You were trying to get out of it and do that. But yeah, so we can't be too hard on ourselves.
I have a question, Jenny. Harold?
Yes.
It occurs to me that we would need to surround ourselves with loving people, or people who can show you who you are. I seem to think that I remember when I was going to church groups that it was a way for me to pray, but for other people to say how they saw me, and it was different from the way I saw myself. And that was extremely empowering when people said, "Oh, but I see this in you." And I said, "Really?" Those kinds of things helped me. So would you suggest that you found people that you could actually be that were a sounding board for you, that actually helped you to start to see yourself as an empowered person rather than someone? The self-talk that we do to ourselves is often the most detrimental, and it can keep you bound to all of that's happening. So did you surround yourselves with people who could tell you the truth about yourself or give you a different perspective?
I might take this one on.
Thank you.
Look, I have to say I was extremely fortunate to find some really key people. And in fact, some of them popped up from the most unexpected places. So, I felt I had a lot of friends. And when this sort of thing happens and it becomes, exposed, it was amazing how many friends that I thought were close disappeared. Now, I don't harbour any resentment. I did at the time, but I certainly don't anymore, because I know how awkward it is if, for any awful thing that happens, a death of a close one, and most people have no idea what to say, how to react. If there's a death in the family on the whole, as long as it's age appropriate, so if it's a parent, an aged parent, they might come around with a casserole or a bottle of wine or whatever, and reminisce on how marvelous that person was, which is appropriate and is great. But when it comes to divorce, people just scatter. And the other thing I found was that particularly female friends, immediately they saw me as a threat, a potential threat to their happiness and the safety and sanctity of their home life, because I suddenly was a pariah and I was likely to go after their man. Now, nothing could have been further from the truth at the time. And in fact, I probably would have, I'd rather have been run over by a bus than contemplate something like that. But it was amazing how many people, even actively crossed the street to avoid me. And I was just like, whereas with a death in the family on the whole, yes, people might be awkward, but they don't find you a threat. Divorce is so strange and unique. And I don't know, because I'm not male, but from the conversations I've had with them, I don't feel they get the same treatment as we do. All of a sudden it's like, oh, well, Felicity's was married for years, and my ex-husband was a pretty, and probably still is, quite good looking by anybody's standard. But they immediately thought, oh, she'll be desperate to get her hands on my husband. So strange.
So then, where were the groups? Where was the support? I mean, the friends deserted you, but where did you find? I'm thinking, trying to plumb how churches might be able to offer. What are we able to offer people that is supportive, that is empowering, and so
on? Simon, I'm sorry to
there you go.
But I was exceedingly fortunate in that, and I know certainly there's not been really good press for the Anglican Church, particularly as we've in the last 5 years done some pretty groundbreaking research on this, and the rates of DFB are actually marginally higher within a Anglican church than in the secular community. There's not a lot in it, but it's still significant. And that wasn't my experience. I kept going to church. In fact, but I had to change parishes because my husband and his now wife attended the same parish, and it was so awkward. I just left. But the parish priest was amazing, and she took me aside and said, what the hell is going on? And I mean in the nicest possible way. She'd been observing my behaviour for weeks and realised something terrible is going on here. And she really wanted to get to the bottom of it, and she did. But she was very patient with me, and she was the one that actually showed me the circle of violence, the Duluth wheel. And my goodness, what a light bulb moment that was for me. Because up until that point, I had no idea that what I was going through. I just thought he was grumpy, difficult, and clearly having an affair by that stage. I was just this worn-out dish rag of a woman that, was useless and cast to the side, and in a total mess, and feeling like, well, my whole world had imploded at that point in time, and where on earth was I going to find any way of scrambling out of this mess? So, but through her wise counsel, and then some amazing women I worked with. One in particular was a young, probably about 10 years younger than me, and she recognised signs, and I thought to the outside world everything was fine, and I was managing, and nothing to see here. Got to keep my job. I've got to keep my job because, oh my goodness, we're going to be out in the streets if I don't. And she lived in New South Wales, and she'd planned a trip to come up and spend 3 days with me. And of course, I'm thinking, oh no, marketing manager coming to spend 3 days with me. Oh, what am I going to do? Anyway, we were driving down to the Gold Coast and that's the thing. So when you're stuck in a car for a good couple of hours, you have to chat. And she very graciously started to tell me about some of her story and her background. And it turned out she had been in the most abusive marriage, and to the point where when she made an exit plan when she went into labour, and she actually asked the staff to keep her then husband out of the labour room, saying he won't cope with it. And she convinced him that it wasn't the place that, she didn't need him there. It wasn't appropriate, rah, rah, rah. And by the time she'd had the baby, she left within about 3 days, or maybe she got 5 days, I don't know. But within that time, that had given her an excuse to pack a decent sized bag, the baby bag with a few clothes. And leading up to that, she had managed to find some cheap accommodation. She had packed her car with things that sort of looked innocent, if you like. It looked like she'd taken excess clothing to the laundry, or she had a few baby blankets in the back, all this sort of stuff. So she packed her car, she disguised everything, and then she went and had the birth of her baby. And then as soon as they released her from hospital, she just ran. And he had no idea where she went. And then he was chasing her because she had taken off with his child. So, Gosh, it was just extraordinary. So with that, the floodgates opened, and then there were 2 or 3 others that popped up out of that, because they went, yeah, I've been through something similar too. And we ended up being, fantastic friends, and they were great support. So Carol, you're right. It's amazing where people can pop up from, and church can absolutely be a wonderful place to provide that support.
Any other comments on that particular issue about where support can emerge and what things can be helpful and less than helpful?
Yes,
I do think. Sorry.
I was able to go to a series by Relationships Australia. It was called Breaking the Cycle. And that was, so if I can remember going after work one day and my feet were going there and my head was going, but why do I have to go here? And other days I was so dog tired, I didn't want to be going there at night. And I remember the particular night I had a lovely PowerShell bracelet on my wrist. And at this particular stage, 2 or 3 weeks into it, we could get active and write words or different things. And I was down on the floor and my PowerShell bracelet broke. And I went, no, but that was me breaking the cycle. I really had to break that. And that was outside in a group of Relationships Australia. So that was very good. I still have the book to this day on doing that and going through that. So I found that very helpful. And then one by one, different people in the church were able to just come alongside of me or say, oh, I noticed that, or help popped up in the most amazing places eventually.
Yes. Look, we are running out of time, so I might draw things to a close now. I hope, if nothing else, we've opened up this conversation. This is not something that will stop after 1 hour. The whole practice of forgiveness is one that is such an important part, and such an important part of what churches can add to the territory of domestic and family violence. Charmaine and Felicity, our really deep thanks for your contribution tonight. I've certainly come away with lots of ideas and lots of just additional insight, even though I have heard some of those things from both of you previously. So thank you very much for that. It takes so much bravery and so much reflection, and often reflecting on past trauma can revisit that. So do take care. For those of you looking for resources outside of the church environment, I would really recommend the short videos that are on the Not Now, Not Ever Together website from the Queensland Government, where they've got a number of short videos of people giving various testimonies around this issue. So if you're on the lookout for things that you can use in your own work, in your own practice, they would be perhaps 2 years old now. More recently, there's also been some really excellent videos in training that has been developed, targeted to sort of first responders, really, to people who are on the front line of service delivery, mainly in healthcare, in police and those areas, but it could extend to people running housing services, crisis services generally. And they're particularly focused in identifying domestic and family violence amongst LGBTIQ community. There's one particularly powerful one that I always get a bit of you take a breath when you hear that, no matter how many times you do, where a man relays an experience that he went to his GP. He had a long-term GP, and this man was well known within the LGBTI community as being particularly aware and conscious of this community. And he went to this doctor and relayed that he felt that he was depressed. And the doctor heard his story and said to him, asked him a couple of questions and said, I think you're in an abusive relationship. And he relayed then the power that having someone say that back to him, particularly someone in this doctor's position, had towards him eventually freeing himself from that abusive relationship. The abuse casts a long shadow. We know that none of these processes are linear, that we progress and regress, and that's part of our lifting and our deepening of understanding of the impacts of domestic and family violence and its prevalence within church communities. I'll close off now, and perhaps, Carol, you could give us a closing prayer.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jenny. I think you just saw on the screen, I hope people are still with us, about next month's offering, the Not in My Church series online, and perhaps a working title Jenny came up with is As We Forgive Them. So we're continuing the conversation about forgiveness, and we're inviting you to join us on Thursday, the 18th of September, just before the school holidays. So we have another one in October, and that's particularly about coercive control. And then that will be our series wound up for the year. And we have a couple of other options that we do in November and December. We write resources for the 16 days of activism. So thank you for your attendance this evening. And I'd ask our God to be with us all this evening, and for those who are in these situations and are not able to free themselves, that we can be people of change in our prayer life, in our actively observing and being able to give a kind word when perhaps that's all that is needed. So gracious God, we thank you for these two brave women who have shared their story this evening, and all the others who are trapped in situations. Help them to find peace and a way out, and that we can be agents of change in our churches and in our communities. We ask all this in the name of Jesus, your Son, our Lord. Amen.
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 Good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let us know